London's wealth has left behind more than just history. It's left behind houses, massive, crumbling mansions that once held the city's richest families. But when money runs out and families die off, these places don't just sit empty. They become something else entirely. I'm going to tell you about 4 abandoned mansions in London, 4 places where I witnessed things that still keep me awake at night. I used to explore abandoned buildings for my photography blog. I thought I was just documenting decay and forgotten architecture. I was wrong. These weren't just empty houses. They were prisons for things that should have moved on long ago. Things that died in those rooms and refused to leave. Things that get angry when strangers walk through their doors. Let me start with the Blackwood Estate in Hampstead, the place where I learned that some families never really leave their homes. I found the first body in the dining room. Not a fresh body. This was old, decades old, but it was sitting upright in a chair at the head of a long wooden table, still wearing a moldy dinner jacket. The smell hit me before I even saw it. Sweet and rotten, like fruit left in the sun too long. But here's what made my hands shake as I held my camera. There were 4 place settings on that table. 4 plates with food still on them. Food that looked like it had been served that morning. Steam was still rising from one of the bowls. I had checked every door and window before I came inside. They were all locked. Chains and boards covered most of them. No one had been in this house for 30 years. So who set that table? And who was cooking in a kitchen that had no power? Let me back up. This was October 2019. I had been exploring abandoned places around London for about 2 years. The Blackwood Estate caught my attention because of its size and the mystery around it. The house sat on 3 acres in Hampstead, hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted iron gate. The Blackwood family had owned it since the 1800s. They made their fortune in shipping and trade, but by the 1990s, the last family members had either died or moved away. The house had been sitting empty ever since. Local kids said it was haunted, but local kids always say that about old houses. I had done my research. Property records, newspaper archives, even talked to some neighbors. The last resident was Margaret Blackwood, an elderly woman who lived alone with her staff. She died in 1991, and the house was supposed to be demolished, but legal issues kept it tied up in courts for years. Eventually, everyone just forgot about it. I approached the house on a gray Tuesday morning. The front gate was chained, but I found a gap in the hedge that led to the back garden. The yard was a jungle of dead roses and broken fountains. Ivy covered the entire back wall of the house, but I could see broken windows on the ground floor. I squeezed through a window into what used to be a library. Books were scattered everywhere, pages yellow and curling. But the books weren't randomly thrown around. They were arranged in neat piles, like someone had been organizing them recently. That should have been my first warning. I spent about an hour photographing the library and the main hallway. The house was massive, easily 20 rooms spread across 3 floors. Every step I took made the old wooden floors creak and groan. But sometimes I heard creaking from rooms I hadn't been in yet. Footsteps on the floor above me when I was alone on the ground level. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noise. But then I found the dining room. The body in the chair was definitely real. I could smell it, see the bones poking through the rotted clothing. But the food on the table looked fresh. Soup that was still warm. Bread that didn't have mold on it. Wine in crystal glasses that looked like it had just been poured. I took pictures, but my hands were shaking so badly that most of them came out blurry. I needed to get closer to document this properly, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. That's when I heard the kitchen door swing open behind me. I turned around slowly. No one was there, but I could hear sounds coming from the kitchen now. Pots clanking, water running. The soft whistle of a kettle is starting to boil. I walked toward the kitchen, my camera ready. The sounds got louder as I got closer. I could hear someone humming a tune I'd never heard before. A woman's voice, old and scratchy. I pushed the kitchen door open. The kitchen was empty, but every burner on the old gas stove was on. Blue flames danced under pots and pans that looked like they had been cooking for hours. Steam rose from a kettle that was starting to whistle, louder and louder. But there was no gas line connected to the house. I had checked the utility records. The gas had been shut off in 1991. I reached out to turn off one of the burners, and that's when I felt a hand grab my wrist. Ice-cold fingers wrapped around my arm with a grip stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I looked down, but I couldn't see anything. Just the feeling of something holding me back from those flames. The humming stopped. The kitchen went completely silent except for that whistling kettle getting louder and louder. I yanked my arm free and stumbled backward. The invisible grip let go, but I could still feel where those fingers had touched me. My wrist was ice cold and turning red in the exact shape of a hand. The kettle whistle reached a screaming pitch, but instead of just the normal whistle sound, I started to hear something else mixed in. A voice. A woman's voice screaming along with the kettle, screaming words I couldn't understand, but the tone was pure rage. Every pot on the stove started to boil over at once. Steam filled the kitchen so thick I could barely see my own hands. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. But those flames on the stove kept burning, getting bigger and brighter. I ran. I sprinted through the dining room, past that body still sitting at the table. But as I ran by, I heard the chair scrape against the floor. I glanced back and saw the corpse turning its head to watch me go. The jaw opened and closed like it was trying to say something. I dove through the library window and didn't stop running until I reached the street. When I finally looked back at the house, I could see smoke pouring out of the broken windows. But there were no flames, just thick, black smoke that smelled like rotting meat. I called the fire department from my phone. They arrived 20 minutes later, but by then the smoke had stopped. They searched the house and found no signs of fire, no gas leak, no electrical problems. They did find the body in the dining room, though. Margaret Blackwood, the last owner. She had been dead for 28 years, sitting at that table the entire time. The coroner said she died of natural causes, but couldn't explain why the body was so well preserved or why there was fresh food on the table. I never published those photos. Every single image I took in that house came out completely black, like the film had been exposed to light, but I kept the red handprint on my wrist for 3 weeks. 5 finger marks that wouldn't fade no matter what I tried. That house burned down 2 months later. Electrical fire, they said, but I know the truth. Some residents don't want visitors. The piano started playing at exactly 3:17 a.m. The same song every night for 7 nights straight. But here's what made it impossible to ignore. The piano was on the 3rd floor of a house that had no stairs to the 3rd floor anymore. I was staying in the Ashford Manor for a week, documenting the decay for an art project. The local historical society had given me permission to photograph the interior before it was demolished. They even let me camp inside to get shots during different lighting conditions. What they didn't tell me was about the music. The first night, I thought someone was playing a radio somewhere in the neighborhood. The melody was beautiful but sad, like a lullaby someone would sing to a dying child. But when I walked outside to find the source, the music was definitely coming from above me, from the 3rd floor of the manor, the 3rd floor that had been sealed off for 60 years. Ashford Manor was built in 1847 by Thomas Ashford, a wealthy textile merchant. The family lived there for over a century, but tragedy seemed to follow them everywhere. 3 children died of disease in the 1890s. Thomas's wife threw herself from the 3rd floor window in 1903. His eldest son died in World War I. By the 1950s, only one family member remained. Eleanor Ashford, a spinster who lived alone with her piano. Eleanor was known throughout Kensington as the piano teacher. Children from wealthy families would come to the manor every afternoon for lessons. She taught in the music room on the 3rd floor, in front of a massive window that looked out over Hyde Park. But in 1962, something went wrong. The children stopped coming. Neighbors heard screaming coming from the house one night, and then silence. When police finally checked on Eleanor, they found her dead at her piano. Heart attack, they ruled. She had been dead for almost a week. The strangest part was what they found in the music room. 23 small chairs arranged in perfect rows in front of the piano, like she had been expecting students. But school records showed that Eleanor hadn't taught a lesson in over 2 months before her death. After Eleanor died, the family lawyers sealed off the 3rd floor. Too dangerous, they said. The wooden stairs had rotted and the floor might collapse. The rest of the house sat empty for decades until the city decided to tear it down. I arrived on a Monday in November 2020. The house was massive but felt hollow, like something important had been carved out of it. I set up my sleeping bag in the main parlor on the ground floor, surrounded by my camera equipment. I should have left after the first night. The piano music started just after 3 a.m. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The melody was complex but repetitive, like someone practicing the same piece over and over again. It was beautiful, but there was something wrong with it. Some of the notes sounded flat, like the piano was old and out of tune. I grabbed a flashlight and walked through the house, trying to find the source. The music was definitely coming from above me, but when I found the staircase to the 3rd floor, it was blocked by a brick wall. Solid bricks were mortared in place, with a metal sign that read, "Condemned, do not enter." But I could hear the music clearly through that wall. Someone was playing piano about 20 feet above my head. The music stopped abruptly at 3:33 a.m., exactly 16 minutes, like clockwork. The second night, the same thing happened, 3:17 a.m. to 3:33 a.m. The same song, the same out-of-tune notes. But this time, I heard something else mixed in with the piano. Children's voices, singing along with the melody. At least 20 different voices, all young, all perfectly in harmony. I called the Historical Society the next morning. The woman I spoke with seemed nervous when I mentioned the music. She told me that other people had reported hearing things, but it was probably just sound echoing from neighboring houses. "Old buildings play tricks on your ears," she said, but I knew what I was hearing. By the 4th night, I had figured out how to get to the 3rd floor. There was a service ladder in the kitchen that led to a maintenance hatch in the ceiling. The hatch opened into a narrow crawl space that ran above the 2nd floor rooms. If I crawled to the far end, I could find another hatch that led into the sealed 3rd floor. At 3:15 a.m. on Friday night, I was crouched in that crawl space with my camera, waiting. My plan was to drop through the hatch right when the music started and finally see what was happening in that room. 3:17 a.m. came and went. No music. I waited until 4 a.m., but the 3rd floor stayed silent. It was like whatever was up there knew I was watching. That should have been enough for me. I should have packed up and left, but I was obsessed now. I needed to see that room. On Saturday night, I decided to go up to the 3rd floor before 3:17 a.m. I would hide in the music room and wait for whatever was going to happen. The crawl space was cramped and filled with dust that made me cough, but I made it to the far hatch without too much trouble. When I pushed it open and dropped down into the 3rd floor, my flashlight beam swept across a room that took my breath away. The music room looked exactly like it had in 1962. Fresh sheet music was scattered across a grand piano. 23 small wooden chairs were arranged in perfect rows, like students were expected any minute. There was even chalk dust on a blackboard in the corner, with musical notes written in careful handwriting. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, like the room had been preserved but not touched in decades. I found a corner where I could hide behind an old bookshelf and turned off my flashlight. Then I waited. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the piano bench creaked like someone was sitting down. The piano keys started moving by themselves, playing that same haunting melody I had heard every night. But now, I could see that no one was touching them. Invisible fingers pressed down each key with perfect timing. Then the chairs started filling up. I couldn't see the children, but I could see the chairs responding to their weight. 23 chairs, each one creaking slightly as something sat down. I could hear them whispering to each other, excited voices talking about their lesson. And then I heard Eleanor's voice, clear, as if she was standing right next to me. "Good evening, children. Tonight we're going to learn a very special song, a song that will help you stay with me forever." The children started singing along with the piano, but their voices weren't happy anymore. They sounded scared, confused. Some of them were trying to get up from their chairs but couldn't. I could see the chairs rocking back and forth like invisible children were struggling against something holding them down. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds. My breath came out in clouds, but I didn't dare move from my hiding spot. The piano music got louder and more aggressive. Eleanor's voice rose above it all, no longer kind and patient. Now she sounded desperate, angry. "You can't leave. You promised you would stay. You promised you would keep me company." The children started crying. Not the normal crying of upset kids, but the desperate sobbing of pure terror. And underneath it all, that piano kept playing the same melody over and over again. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up from my hiding spot and ran for the hatch. But as soon as I moved, everything stopped. The piano, the crying, Eleanor's voice, complete silence. I looked back at the room. All 23 chairs were facing me now, even though I hadn't heard them move. And in the sudden quiet, I could hear something that made my blood freeze. Breathing. 23 sets of small lungs, all breathing in perfect unison. I climbed through that hatch so fast, I scraped half the skin off my arms. I didn't stop moving until I was outside the house, standing in the street with my camera bag and sleeping bag. The next morning, I called the Historical Society and told them I was done with the project. I didn't give them a reason, and they didn't ask for one. The house was demolished 3 weeks later, but according to neighbors, they can still hear piano music on quiet nights. Always the same song, always at 3:17 a.m. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the voices of children singing along. I still have nightmares about those empty chairs turning to face me. But what really keeps me awake is wondering, where did those 23 children go when the house came down? I watched a man walk through a brick wall, not around it, not through a door I couldn't see, through the solid brick wall itself, like it wasn't even there. He was wearing a butler's uniform from maybe the 1920s. Black jacket, white gloves, carrying a silver tray with tea service on it. He walked across the main hallway of the Pemberton Estate at exactly 6 p.m., just like he probably did every day for decades when he was alive. The problem was that the wall he walked through was built in 1987. 20 years after the last butler died in that house, I had been photographing the estate for 3 days, and I thought I had seen everything weird it had to offer. Doors that opened by themselves, footsteps in empty rooms, the occasional cold spot that made my camera fog up. But watching that butler serve tea to people who had been dead for 50 years made me realize I wasn't just documenting an abandoned house. I was documenting a place where time had broken down completely. The Pemberton Estate in Belgravia was the kind of wealth that most people can't even imagine. Built in 1889 by Sir Charles Pemberton, it had 43 rooms, including a ballroom that could hold 300 guests. The Pembertons threw parties that were legendary across London. Royalty attended their dinners. Politicians made deals in their smoking room, but the family had a dark secret. They were obsessed with death. Not in a gothic, romantic way. Charles Pemberton genuinely believed he could communicate with the dead, and he turned his mansion into a playground for spiritualists and mediums. The third floor was converted into seance rooms. The basement became a laboratory where Charles experimented with photography that he claimed could capture spirits. The obsession got worse after Charles died in 1923. His son William took over the house and the fascination with the afterlife. William held seances every week, trying to contact his father. He hired mediums, fortune tellers, and anyone who claimed they could speak to the dead. By the 1960s, the family fortune was gone. Most of it had been spent on psychic investigators and elaborate funeral ceremonies for family members. The last Pemberton, William's daughter Catherine, died alone in 1967. She had fired all the servants except for one elderly butler named Harrison, who found her body in the library 3 days after she passed. Harrison died of a heart attack a week later, right there in the house. After that, the estate sat empty. I got permission to photograph it in March 2021. The house was scheduled for renovation into luxury apartments, and a real estate developer wanted documentation of the original interior before they started tearing down walls. I had no idea that some of those walls were the only things keeping the past and present separated. The first 2 days were normal. As far as abandoned mansion photography goes, I documented the ballroom with its crystal chandeliers still hanging from the ceiling, the library where Catherine Pemberton died, books still scattered across the floor where she had dropped them, the seance rooms on the 3rd floor, complete with round tables and Ouija boards, left exactly where they had been used 50 years ago. But I started noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Every day at 6 p.m., I would hear the front door open and close, followed by footsteps walking across the main hallway. Always the same pattern. 27 steps from the door to the base of the main staircase, then a pause, then 13 more steps toward the dining room. The first day, I assumed it was someone from the real estate company checking on me, but when I went to investigate, no one was there. The front door was still locked from the inside, exactly how I had left it. The second day, I set up my camera to record the hallway at 6 p.m. The footage showed the front door opening by itself, followed by the sound of footsteps, but no one was visible in the frame, just the door swinging open and the sound of someone walking across empty space. On the third day, I decided to wait in the hallway and see what happened. At exactly 6 p.m., the front door opened. I was standing about 10 feet away, camera ready. The door swung inward slowly, like someone was being careful not to make noise. Then I heard the footsteps start, 27 steps across the marble floor. I could see small indentations appearing in the dust, where invisible feet were walking. The footsteps were accompanied by a soft, clinking sound, like silverware rattling on a tray. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. But as he got closer to me, he became more solid. An elderly man in a perfectly pressed butler's uniform, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. His face was pale, and his eyes were focused straight ahead, like he was concentrating on not dropping anything. He walked right past me without acknowledging that I was there. I could smell him as he went by, shoe polish and old cologne and something else. Something sweet and sick, like flowers left too long in a vase. He continued toward the dining room, but instead of going through the doorway, he walked straight into the wall where the doorway used to be. I stood there staring at that wall for a full minute, trying to process what I had just seen. Then, I remembered the architectural plans I had studied before coming to the house. In the original 1889 layout, there had been a doorway from the hallway directly into the dining room. But during renovations in 1987, that doorway had been bricked up and a new entrance had been added from the kitchen. The butler was still following his routine from before 1987. He was walking through a house that no longer existed in the same configuration. I spent the rest of that evening in the dining room, waiting to see if he would appear again. At 6:15 p.m., I heard the soft clinking of silverware from inside the wall. Then, the butler emerged from the solid brick, still carrying his tray. But this time, he wasn't alone. The dining room started filling up with people I couldn't quite see. Transparent figures in evening wear, sitting down at a table that wasn't there anymore. I could hear conversations in posh accents, the scrape of chairs being pulled out, the clink of wine glasses. The butler moved around the room serving tea to empty air, but I could tell from his movements that he was navigating around guests. He would step to the side to avoid someone, reach over invisible shoulders to set down cups. And then I realized what I was watching. This wasn't just one ghost repeating his routine. This was an entire dinner party from decades ago, playing out every night at 6 p.m. The butler, the guests, even the furniture, all of it was still happening in some version of the house that existed alongside the physical building. But the scariest part came when the butler finished serving and looked directly at me. His eyes weren't the glassy, unfocused eyes of most spirits I had encountered. They were sharp and intelligent, and very much aware that I didn't belong at this dinner party. He walked toward me, still carrying his empty tray. As he got closer, his face became clearer. I could see that his skin was gray and his lips were blue. This wasn't just a ghost. This was something that had died badly and was trapped in its final moments. He stopped right in front of me and spoke in a voice that sounded like air leaking from a punctured lung. "Sir, you weren't invited to this gathering. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave." The temperature in the room dropped so fast that ice started forming on the windows. Every piece of camera equipment I had brought into the dining room shut down at once. The batteries didn't just die, they froze, solid. I ran out of that room and didn't stop running until I was outside the house. When I looked back through the dining room windows, I could see warm light flickering inside, like candles were burning. Shadows moved back and forth behind the glass, and I could hear the faint sound of laughter and conversation. I never went back to finish the photography project. The real estate company wasn't happy, but they found someone else to document the house. That photographer lasted 2 days before he quit without explanation. The house is still being renovated, but work keeps getting delayed. The construction crew reports tools going missing, unexplained power outages, and the sound of a dinner party coming from empty rooms. Most recently, they installed security cameras throughout the house. Every night at 6 p.m., the cameras record the same thing: a formal dinner party in the dining room, complete with elegantly dressed guests and an elderly butler serving tea. The problem is, when the construction crew arrives the next morning, the dining room is empty except for dust and construction equipment. But the cameras never lie. The children were playing hide and seek in a house where children had been missing for 40 years. I could hear them running through the rooms above me, their footsteps light and quick across the wooden floors. Giggles echoed down through the ceiling, followed by whispered conversations about who was it and where the best hiding spots were. The problem was that I had just spent 2 hours searching every room in Ravenscroft House. I had photographed every corner, every closet, every space where a person could hide. The house was completely empty. So who were those children? And why did their voices sound so familiar? I had seen the missing person posters in the local library while researching the house. 7 children had disappeared from the Ravenscroft neighborhood between 1978 and 1981. Different families, different ages, but all of them had one thing in common. They were last seen playing near the abandoned house at the end of Ravenscroft Lane. Now I knew where they had gone. The question was, were they still playing, or were they trapped? Ravenscroft House was built in 1902 by Dr. Edmund Ravenscroft, a pediatrician who specialized in treating children with behavioral problems. The house was both his family home and his private practice. He converted the entire second floor into examination rooms and treatment areas where he worked with troubled kids from wealthy London families. Dr. Ravenscroft had some unconventional ideas about child psychology. He believed that children who acted out were actually gifted and that their behavior problems were signs of supernatural abilities trying to emerge. His treatment methods involved isolation, sensory deprivation, and what he called spiritual awakening exercises. Most of his colleagues thought he was brilliant but eccentric. Parents paid enormous fees to bring their difficult children to him because his success rate was impressive. Children who came to him angry and violent left calm and obedient, but they also left differently, distant, like something important had been taken out of them. Ravenscroft died in 1954, and his practice died with him. The house sat empty for decades, slowly deteriorating. By the 1970s, it was the kind of place that local kids dared each other to approach on Halloween. That's when the disappearances started. Sarah Mitchell, age 8, was last seen playing in the garden behind Ravenscroft House in September 1978. Tommy Henderson, age 10, disappeared while riding his bicycle past the house in March 1979. 5 more children vanished over the next 2 years, always near the house, always without a trace. Police searched the property multiple times but never found evidence of foul play. The house was locked up tight, windows boarded, no signs of recent entry. Eventually, the case went cold. I arrived at Ravenscroft House in April 2021, 40 years after the last disappearance. I was working on a project about abandoned medical facilities, and Dr. Ravenscroft's practice fit perfectly. I had no idea I was walking into a playroom for the dead. The first floor of Ravenscroft House looked like every other abandoned building I had explored. Wallpaper peeling from the walls, floorboards warped from decades of water damage, rooms filled with broken furniture covered in dust and bird droppings. But the second floor was different. Dr. Ravenscroft's examination rooms had been preserved almost perfectly. Medical equipment from the 1950s was still arranged on metal tables. Filing cabinets were filled with patient records, written in careful handwriting. Even the children's toys in the waiting area looked like they had been played with recently. Too recently. The wooden blocks were stacked in neat towers. A dollhouse was arranged with tiny furniture in perfect miniature rooms. Coloring books were open to pages with fresh crayon marks, like someone had been working on them that morning. I started photographing everything, but I kept getting distracted by sounds from other parts of the house. Footsteps in the hallway when I was alone in an examination room. Doors closed softly when I hadn't heard them open. And always, the sound of children whispering just out of earshot. It was while I was photographing Dr. Ravenscroft's office that I found the patient files that changed everything. 7 manila folders were sitting on top of his desk, separate from the others in the filing cabinet. Each folder had a child's name written on it in blue ink: Sarah Mitchell, Tommy Henderson, and 5 others. The exact names from the missing person cases. But these files were dated from the 1950s, not the 1970s. I opened Sarah Mitchell's file first. Inside were pages of notes about an 8-year-old girl who was brought to Dr. Ravenscroft for violent outbursts and claims of seeing dead people. According to the notes, Sarah was treated with isolation therapy and spiritual realignment procedures for 6 months in 1953. The final entry in her file was dated December 15, 1953. Patient has achieved complete spiritual integration. She will remain with us permanently to help with future cases. Every file told the same story. 7 children, all claiming to have supernatural abilities, all treated by Dr. Ravenscroft in the 1950s, all of them ending with the same note about permanent residence. I was still reading when I heard a child's voice directly behind me. "Are you here to play with us?" I turned around quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty office, with afternoon sunlight streaming through dusty windows. "We've been waiting for someone new," the voice continued. It sounded like a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Dr. Ravenscroft said we should always be nice to visitors. More voices joined the first one. Different children, different ages, all of them excited and friendly. They were coming from all around me now, behind me, beside me, from the corners of the room I couldn't see. "Do you want to see our rooms?" asked a boy's voice. "We have the best hiding spots," giggled a girl. "Dr. Ravenscroft taught us games that go on forever and ever," said another boy, but his voice had an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The voices got closer, more insistent. "You can't leave yet. said the first girl. "We haven't shown you everything." The room started getting colder. My breath came out in clouds, and frost began forming on the windows. But the children's voices remained warm and inviting, like they were trying to lure me into joining their games. "Look at us," they whispered in unison. "Look at us and see what Dr. Ravenscroft made us into." I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned toward the center of the room, and that's when I saw them. 7 children, transparent but clearly visible, standing in a circle around Dr. Ravenscroft's desk. They were wearing clothes from different eras: 1950s dresses, 1970s t-shirts, school uniforms from decades past. But their faces were wrong. Their eyes were too bright, too knowing. These weren't normal children anymore. "He taught us how to stay," said Sarah Mitchell, her voice sounding exactly like it had in 1978 when she was 8 years old. "He taught us how to bring others to play with us." "We've been so lonely," added Tommy Henderson. 40 years is a long time to wait for friends." The circle started moving closer to me. Their footsteps made no sound, but I could feel them approaching like a cold wind. My camera started malfunctioning, the display flickering between normal images and pictures of children who weren't supposed to be there. "Stay with us," they all said together. "Dr. Ravenscroft's games are the best games. They never end." That's when I understood what had happened to those missing children in the 1970s. They hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. They had been recruited. 7 lonely spirits had found a way to bring new friends to their eternal playdate. I threw my shoulder against the door and felt it give way. I stumbled into the hallway and ran for the stairs, but the children followed me. I could hear them laughing and calling my name, even though I had never told them what it was. "Come back," they shouted as I reached the first floor. "The game isn't over. We're still playing." I burst through the front door and kept running until I reached my car. When I looked back at the house, I could see small faces pressed against every second-floor window, watching me go. I drove straight to the local police station and told them everything. They listened politely, took notes, and promised to investigate. But I knew they wouldn't find anything. Those children had been hiding from adults for 40 years. They weren't going to reveal themselves to anyone who might try to take them away from their games. The house was demolished 6 months later, but not before 3 more construction workers quit the job. They all reported the same thing: children's voices calling to them from empty rooms, asking them to stay and play. I still have nightmares about those faces in the windows. 7 children who should have grown up, had families, lived full lives. Instead, they're trapped in an endless game of hide and seek, always looking for new players to join them. Sometimes I wonder if Dr. Ravenscroft knew what he was creating, if he understood that his spiritual integration was really a way to trap young souls in his house forever, or if he was just another victim, manipulated by something darker that had been living in that house long before he arrived. Either way, those children are still there, still playing, still waiting. And if you ever find yourself walking past an abandoned house and hear the sound of children laughing inside, my advice is simple: keep walking, don't look back. And whatever you do, don't play along, because some games are designed to last forever. Hit subscribe if you want more horror stories like this. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. And after you hear these stories, tell me which one messed with your head the most. Because trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why some doors should stay locked forever.